Hello everyone, today we are going to be talking about periodization. Tune in to learn why this concept is so bad. And before I get into it, make sure to like and subscribe. What is periodization? So periodization is a concept that involves changing your training priority as time goes on. So you're changing your training priority as time goes on. For, some common ones are hypertrophy blocks, speed blocks, power blocks, coordination blocks, skills blocks, anything like that. They're normally organized into blocks where you will be prioritizing a certain training outcome or quality. Now, the reason why this is so instantly wrong, you should be prioritizing what's important all the time. If for a sprinter, that's speed, you should always be working on training things that will help improve speed. For a bodybuilder, you are always training for hypertrophy. You're never going to do a speed block for a bodybuilder because it's a weakness for them. That is completely illogical. This all comes down to having a really good needs analysis system or just understanding the needs of an athlete or an individual. So that comes down to talking about goals, doing research, thinking about time motion analysis, sprints, rest to work ratios, all things like that most people actually have access to. It's just about talking with a client or doing some quick research by yourself to figure out what's actually going to make the biggest difference to athletic performance for that person. Once you know that, you should build your whole program around improving that 24/7. Not improving it for 6 weeks and then doing something different. That makes no sense because you then just lose everything. The body gets rid of peripheral adaptations extremely quickly. So this is why we lose sarcomerogenesis gains so quickly and why you feel sore if you haven't done an exercise or a certain type of exercise for a couple or a few weeks. So if you take 2 or 3 weeks off because you would go on holiday and you come back and try and do any sort of exercise, you will be sore. And it's because all of the muscular adaptations that you had stopping you from getting you sore, all disappeared in 2 to 3 weeks. That is literally how fast it is, okay? Anything that isn't in your brain or spinal cord goes away 2 to 3 weeks and sometimes even faster, okay? It is not worth breaking your training up into blocks, okay? Because you instantly lose gains. Eccentric overload, another great example. This stuff only works if you do it constantly. As soon as you stop doing eccentric overload training, you lose the gains from eccentric overload 2 to 3 weeks. Periodization is silly. So sometimes there may be multiple qualities that are important to a certain athlete, and one of them may be more of a weakness than the others. And you may do a block where you prioritize that weakness. If it's weaker, it will probably just come up by itself without giving any sort of special consideration. But if not, then sure. That might be one example where periodization is actually a good time to use it. You keep all other training normal, but maybe for 4 to 6 weeks, you focus on one thing a little bit more. But why not do it for longer until it's fully consistent? What if after 4 to 6 weeks, you don't see any benefits? It makes more sense that that is just part of the needs analysis that you do and that this client needs a little bit more of this. This is going to be our priority long term, because you're probably not going to bring that weakness up in 4 to 6 weeks, which is a common periodization block. That's a mesocycle, okay? One thing that will always be valid is changing your training during competition times. And the only variable that should actually be changed in these cases is volume and frequency, okay? You should never change the intensity of your exercise or training because that is there for a very good reason. And that's because you're doing that intensity because that is the intensity that elicits the adaptations that you require for your sport. You do volume and frequency for a reason as well, but maintenance takes almost no volume, okay? So we can drop all the way down to 1 times a week frequency and do 2 sets, or we can drop all the way down to 2 times a week frequency and do 1 set in the gym, and also very, very low volumes of aerobic training, speed training, jump training, anything like that. It takes next to nothing to maintain certain qualities. And then that allows for better recovery from competition. And also when you're in high fatigue times like that, it's going to be very hard to make gains. So you may as well just take it easy for a bit and allow your body to get through that competition period before you start trying to build again. So like I said, that's probably the one good example of periodization. Seb Oreb is a big fan of this. He likes to do a little bit of periodization because he says, you know, sometimes a little bit of everything isn't always enough. But I personally do not agree with that, because I think like there's normally not that much, especially for him. He works with a lot of strength athletes. There is not enough going on for strength athletes to need to periodize unless they are elite of the elite. So he has his own special set of rules. I don't even know why I brought it up. But when we're talking about Gen Pop and anywhere up to elite athletes, but he is the elite of the elite. So two other poor examples of periodization, or unnecessary uses, I should say, would be periodizing exercises and periodizing tempo. When we periodize exercises, for example, having a free weight or a machine block or a dumbbell block or a barbell block, we are getting used to an exercise for 4 to 6 weeks. And then as soon as we start to get used to it, we switch to something else. Okay, so this is one that's actually quite common in the fitness space and is incredibly damaging. So we can stimulate a lot of muscle fibers in 4 to 6 weeks, but we can't reach our highest tier threshold motor units and muscle fibers until you have been doing something for quite an extended amount of time. Your body needs to get better at actually recruiting all of the muscle fibers you want to train. That is part of strength, but it's also part of hypertrophy, because when we have a higher strength at something, a lot of it comes from coordination, and that coordination is actually just using more muscle fibers. If you want to get better hypertrophy, you should stick with the same exercises for decades. Okay? Decades. I would say actually that there's probably becomes a point where you've practiced all the exercises enough to get something out of, like a decent amount out of all of them, but it still just doesn't make sense. Like, now, periodizing tempos, this is one where shout out Cody Donald. He mentioned this, one of his Australian flag football trainers was getting them to periodize tempos. I am not a huge fan of this, and research isn't either. There is objectively a couple, no more than a handful of exercise tempos that are going to be best for growth. Number one being as quick as you can control eccentrically, and then pushing as hard as you can concentrically. You do not need to pause at the bottom. You don't need to pause at the top. You are doing the absolute bare minimum to maintain control of the load or weight, and then pushing as hard as you can concentrically, okay? So that's number one. You cannot get any better than that. Anything else is going to be worse. Number two is going to be pausing at the bottom and maintaining a 2 to 3 second eccentric, even maybe 4 is pushing it. This would be the tempo I would use for anyone who's worried about joint pain or injury risk, okay? This takes away a lot of the impulse at the bottom of reps. It also can take away the stretch shortening cycle and reduce performance a little bit. But if we're just trying to reduce injury risk for high risk clients or high risk athletes, then sure, go ahead. It's not going to be the best for strength. It's not going to be the best for muscle growth, but it is going to be great for joint health. That is actually all I have written down for periodization. So thank you if you watched all the way through. That was my episode on periodization. I'm not a huge fan of this, as you can tell. Drop any comments of any other topics you want covered. I'd be more than happy to cover any topics related to fitness. And please, like I said at the start, like the video and subscribe.